Hidden identity seems to be a major theme in Greek mythology. Many characters struggle with their identity in situations where their honour or loyalty is challenged, while others are forced to hide it in situations of danger. In the Homeric epics, the deceptive aspect of this becomes even clearer, with Patroclus pretending to be Achilles, Odysseus pretending to be multiple different people, and Agamemnon disguising himself as a decent human being. But it's clear that it's Odysseus and his story across the epic cycle that makes the most out of the theme of identity, and his struggle to retain who and what he is core to his story. Odysseus is possibly my favourite fictional character ever, and it's simply because of the fact he contains multitudes shamelessly. I believe that across the Iliad and the Odyssey, there are three distinct identities that Odysseus takes on, and they align with his change in attitude, fortune, and mental state. Using this loose guide, you can divide Odysseus, the man of many twists and turns, across the epics into three distinct versions of himself, as the warrior, the beggar, and finally, the king. As if one Odysseus wasn't enough.
Messages from him. Oh yes. Why would he do that? What's the mad fool talking about now?
Hello. Gallifrey High Command. This is the Doctor speaking. Hello. Also the Doctor. Can you hear me? Also the Doctor. Standing ready.
Dear God, three of them. All my worst nightmares at once.
General?
Odysseus the warrior is the one we meet in the Iliad and across into the first section of the Odyssey. This iteration of Odysseus is defined by his aggression, his arrogance, and obsession with kleos and this word. Anyway, these Greek terms are two of the four used in context of the Odyssey's key themes, the others being Xenia and Nostos. Kleos is the fame of the hero and the reputation that comes with it, while Time is usually translated to gifts given to the hero out of respect, but they all sort of combine together to create a general sense of power and awe for a hero figure. Interestingly, despite this characterization, he initially doesn't want to go to war, and he feigns madness by ploughing a field with salt before Agamemnon threatens to place baby Telemachus, his son, in the way of the oxen. After this, it's Odysseus and Diomedes, a very popular pairing, that go and convince Achilles, of all people, to come out of hiding in Skyros and join the Trojan War. In the Iliad, Odysseus seems to take a bit of a backseat in the story as a side character, leaving the main stage to Achilles and Patroclus and the whole conflict between these two groups of the Greeks in the camp. That said, he does participate in or initiate some of the most important moments of the Trojan War. He steals the Palladium, the statue of Athena, with Diomedes, he steals the horses of Rhesus with Diomedes, and then he comes up with the Trojan horse, one of the biggest war crimes of all time. He then also maybe throws a baby off of a tower, but that could also be Achilles' son Neoptolemus. People are a bit hazy on that, and that's also a debate for a different time. What we can see from this period of Odysseus' life in general is that he is sneaky, deceptive, intelligent, but still capable of great violence. A good deal of this seems to be lost in the post-Troy books of the Odyssey, suggesting that the success of the Trojan horse and the war in general sent him into such a dizzying ego trip that he loses all of this intelligence and only maintains the violence, plus this horrific degree of arrogance and pride that in the long term makes him make stupid decisions. So once Troy has gone and had its entire Bronze Age collapse, our jolly little sailor boy takes off across the seas and makes the first of his many poor choices by breaking the laws of Xenia, outstaying by raiding too much in the land of the Cicones, which is apparently a thing you can do. When he retells this story to the Phaeacians, he actually blames his men for this, calling them fools for not listening to him, while in fact he is ignoring his clear lack of effort in getting them away in the first place. Zeus then punishes him for this, or for killing a baby depending on who you ask, and sends a huge storm that drives them all the way to the land of the Lotus Eaters. Some of his men consume this drug, the Lotus, and forget about home, referring to that pesky theme of Nostos I was on about earlier, about homecoming. Unfortunately, our noble hero has to tie his men under the benches of the ship, demonstrating his lack of authority and power over them. Still, at least things got worse. During a brief trip to maybe Sicily, he has the same attitude in the land of the Cyclopes, charging headfirst into the cave of Polyphemus, the man of many Phoemuses, because he wants presents. He then has the nerve to steal the man's cheese. And anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, this warrior character consistently makes impulsive, selfish decisions that come to the detriment of not only himself but also his men, including death sometimes, and it demonstrates poor leadership above all things, which all sort of tied into this idea of hubris and arrogance that he seems to exude at this point in time. However, there do seem to be moments where he sort of comes back to this initial character, intelligent man who we saw in the Iliad. During the episode with the Cyclops, Odysseus answers no one or nobody when asked who he is, and this could potentially be foreshadowing for the total loss of his entire personality that we knew from the Iliad, but it could also be the last time we ever see him be this intelligent and cunning for a very, very long time. This is the closest he will ever come to being his original self until he reaches Ithaca. Unfortunately, what I've just said is kind of completely ruined by the fact that he immediately boasts about this and reveals what his name is to Polyphemus as they escape, which results in Polyphemus cursing Odysseus. His father Poseidon is then following him through the remainder of the epic, and it just goes horribly, horribly wrong for everybody. He's consistently proven to be a poor leader whose pride and arrogance causes calamity after calamity at this point, and it just continues all the way up until Book 5. Chronologically, not actually. He abandons the rest of his fleet to be eaten by the cannibalistic Laestrygonians somewhere in the Mediterranean, don't bother asking why, and then stays on Circe's island of Aeaea for a year. A year for a year, I didn't think about that. His affair with Circe is another curious part of his character. He has no bed slaves that we know of, I think, in the Trojan War, and he seems to be so devoted to Penelope that later on, when Calypso offers him immortality to be her husband, he refuses it, saying that even though she is more beautiful than Penelope, his wife, he would rather be with her. And their reunion is so overwhelmingly love-stricken that I struggle to believe that his affair with Circe is that simple and base. Another part of it is also possibly that this is the first hospitable place that they've actually been to since they left the Greek camp during the Trojan War. And the fact that I've just called the Trojan War hospitable should prove how dangerous and horrifying a lot of this journey is going to be. After a year has passed, Odysseus finally says goodbye to Circe, pets of the lions on the head, and takes a brief jaunt into the underworld before the last remaining ship sails past Scylla and Charybdis, two horrifying sea monsters. And although Odysseus promptly ignores Circe's advice getting around them, another 6 of his men die and eventually they are free. But not for long, because following a misunderstanding over a steak barbecue, Zeus finally nukes his ship and leaves him the only survivor with all of his other Ithacan men dead, until he washes up on Calypso's island of Ogygia, which might be Malta. Maybe. If you didn't get the impression by now, Homeric geography is weird. It's at this point that Odysseus metamorphosizes into his beggar character. And I know what you might be thinking, the beggar disguise only takes place when he returns to Ithaca, and to push you could maybe put it at his arrival at Phaeacia. In terms of appearance, that's true, but if you've known anything about Odysseus, it's that you never take him at face value. In terms of identity, a beggar is what he is. The 7 years that he spends on Calypso's island have been variably interpreted as willful irresponsibility or imprisonment, with some people excusing his nightly adultery with Calypso because you do not say no to a goddess. When we are first introduced to Odysseus in Book 5, it's in this state, crying into a porn star martini on the beaches of Malta and trying to remember all that he used to be and have. He is hardly the hero that we remember from the Trojan War. There's nothing cunning, deceptive, or epic about him at this moment. That is ignoring the fact that he's been there for 7 years and unable to go home, because it's all fun and games when you cheat on your wife with a hot witch goddess, but not when a different one keeps you essentially a prisoner for 7 goddamn years. It takes the divine help of Hermes to coax Calypso into releasing Odysseus from her island, and Hermes' role in Odysseus' life is weird enough. He could be his great-grandfather through his mother Anticlea and her father Autolycos, but some people don't agree and it gets really confusing, so we can ignore that because mythological genealogy is too messy to untangle. And this is a great example of what characterises this beggar identity. Family or not, his reliance on others and inability to help himself is key to this part of his story. This is the first time that Athene, for example, is seen to directly interact with him, helping him get to Phaeacia and then being present on the very final page of the epic. And it can be seen to be largely her help that gets him home. Another reason that this is his lowest moment is that he consistently keeps losing everything that he gains. If we look at a list of all the treasure or wealth he accrues from the Trojan War, you will notice it is remarkably similar to the list of treasure that he loses over the course of the story. As if this wasn't enough, while all this is happening, the suitors are partying up a storm and literally eating him out of house and home by feasting constantly on all of his livestock, which is one of the main measurements of wealth in the ancient world. If you're wondering how Odysseus has managed to maintain his reputation as one of the greatest heroes in mythology, I don't blame you. And if I'm honest, I'm wondering that as well. Meanwhile, in Phaeacia, a young girl named Nausicaa finds a wandering Dilf and brings him to her father, the king. Huh. Odysseus shows he understands his loss of power, solidifying his perception of himself by sitting in the ashes at the palace of Alcinous. This place was reserved for outcasts and vagrants who did not have enough social status to sit around the fire, meaning one of two things. Either Odysseus has begun to perceive himself as a wretch with nothing, or he is using this as a ploy to hide his face and identity. There is no indication in the text that this is the case, but if it was, it could prove Odysseus' intelligence shines through during times of hardship, fading away into pride when he gets too comfortable, as seen earlier. Once back in Ithaca, thanks to the Phaeacians, again, Odysseus is once again reliant on others' hospitality, staying in the home of Eumaeus the swineherd, disguised as a real beggar by Athene. She reveals herself to him and guides him to find loyal friends to begin the restoration. He does briefly change back to his regular form when he meets Telemachus, his son, having not seen him since he was a teeny tiny pathetic little baby man, so not much has really changed. But interestingly, we can mark out a definite change in his personality when they speak to each other. When discussing plans on how to get back to the city and overtake again, Telemachus disagrees with his father around tactics, and Odysseus actually listens, having previously dismissed the advice of minor figures like, I don't know, literal goddesses. Odysseus' circumstances are completely changed, and the humility you'd expect him to gain from this should count for something. There's a direct parallel that seems to be here between who he was during the Iliad and the events of the Trojan War, where he was a leader of men who kept company with kings like Menelaus and Agamemnon, where he now is a beggar whose only friends are outcasts and farmers. When he finally reaches his palace, he is forced to beg for scraps of food from the suitors, and even fights with another beggar, Iris, leading to one of my favourite lines in the entire epic. I mean, really? On a serious note, however, this fight gives us an insight into Odysseus at this time. He debates internally about whether to merely punch Iris or hit him with force so strong it will literally blow his brains out. The choice to refrain from lethal violence to restore his honour is a big development from the violent and arrogant ways we previously saw, because he recognises maintaining his disguise is more important. Guys, he's finally using cognitive faculties again! But that doesn't quite solve the issue of his fractured identity. He then has to try and stop everyone from realising who he is, literally choking his former nurse Euryclea, and hiding himself from Penelope to avoid complicating what is basically a restoration coup. Now this does sound like it would be an element of modern storytelling rather than an ancient one, but we would expect that his time as a beggar, reliant on the help of everyone from deities to pig farmers, would have taught him humility, so when he metamorphosises into his kingly form, he can become a better leader than he was proven to be in the adventure books. So let's take a look at the last stage of his story to see whether this was true or not, and this is the most complicated part, so we're looking closer at language analysis as well. When planning this, I struggled for a while on where I defined Odysseus' king identity to begin. Is it during the battle in the hall? Is it when he reveals himself to Penelope? Or is it when Athena has to stop an entire civil war into Odysseus' job's fall? In the end, I settled on the stringing of the bow in Book 21, because it reaffirms a significant part of Odysseus' identity. The fact that he, and he alone, is able to string the bow reminds the audience and himself that he is a Homeric hero, and it gives him the courage to reveal himself and fight the suitors to restore his royal authority. The drawing of the bow represents his return to warrior status within Bronze Age Greek society. He's gone from the bottom to the top again. Think of it as a sword in the stone type heroic initiation, or proof of nobility. Once the bow has been strung, the battle breaks out. The sheer primality and barbarity of the violence that takes place during the battle is catastrophic, as Odysseus, Telemachus, Philetius and Eumaeus kill 108 well-trained nobles, one after the other. Bearing in mind, two of these individuals are farmers, one is basically a spoiled child, and the only one of them who is really capable of such a task is Odysseus. The four are compared to vultures swooping on their prey, a very sinister and morbid image that continues in the motif of predatorial animalistic imagery ascribed to Odysseus. I would go as far to say that Odysseus has gone temporarily insane, being overwhelmed by the rage he feels for the polluters of his home. Now we need to talk about an epic trope, the Aristeia of the hero. In epic poetry, the Aristeia is usually seen to be the hero's finest hour, acts of intense and grandiose violence against everyone in the vicinity, with no damage done to themselves. Coming from the Greek word aristos, meaning excellent, Aristeia is when one hero in particular excels all of his peers, and can most clearly be found in the Iliad, where multiple characters get the opportunity. Odysseus had no Aristeia in the Iliad, but I would absolutely say that the battle is his moment to shine. Although this would suggest he's returning to a warrior persona, I think the motivation of violence marks the difference. Also, it should be noted that in Mycenaean Greek society, warriors, kings, pretty much the same thing. A warrior culture meant that the best warrior would be the king. That's pretty much how this sort of thing would work. Now, it's time to talk about war crimes, kids! In ancient Greece, supplication was the act of ritual begging. If the supplicant could clasp the knees and chin of whoever they demanded something of, the supplicatee, maybe, was required to honour that request. It was so important that it was considered a crime to deny it. And even worse, when you kill the person supplicating to you. In his apparent madness, Odysseus kills Leodes, the priest of the suitors who officiated their rituals and feasts, who claimed to have never attempted to wed Penelope. Odysseus could not give a solitary and kills him immediately, and is about to kill Phemius the bard, who tries his luck at supplicating, when Telemachus stops him, as well as sparing Medon the herald's life. If it hadn't been for that, Odysseus would probably have continued to murder and rampage through Ithaca until everyone was dead. Interestingly, he is once again respecting the advice of his son Telemachus, who seems to be the only person besides Athena who he actually listens to. Is it because Telemachus is his own flesh and blood? Is there some kind of egotism in here? That's for you to decide. At this stage, Odysseus doesn't seem particularly kingly. He appears to have devolved into a completely different, bestial version of himself, and this is noted in the text. When the suitors are all dead, but the killing far from done, Eurycleia the nurse enters the hall and sees Odysseus covered in blood and gore, and Homer describes him as being like a lion. The choice of words can mean two different things. Either the lion, associated with kingliness and strength, is a positive description that means he has re-established himself as a monarch, or he has lost his mind to madness and is nothing more than a violent animal. The image that this scene conjures up is visceral and powerful. Odysseus is naked, covered in blood, with a stained sword in one hand and a bow in the other, standing before a pile of corpses. By ancient standards, this is a triumph and a positive overthrow of corruption, but by our standards, this is a horrifying coup. And it continues as well with the infamous hanging of the maids. 12 of Penelope's handmaidens are hung like birds in a snare for the crime of sleeping with the suitors, which Odysseus maintains is a betrayal. Margaret Atwood's The Penelopead focuses a lot on the life of Penelope and these 12 maids, and the other 38, who are instead referred to being sexually assaulted by the suitors rather than willing sexual partners. In this interpretation, the hanging is considerably more unjust than it was before, which is already pretty bad. The women are part of the oikos, the home, and are therefore Odysseus' property. Any deviation from this is deemed as betrayal. Just a brief side point, the birds the maids are described as could be very, very important. Doves and thrushes were both symbols of Aphrodite, goddess of sex and love, who is markedly absent from the epic besides a short little side story that the bard sings in Phaeacia. In turn, Aphrodite descended from the goddess Astarte and Ishtar, Mesopotamian deities whose divine domains include sex, love, and war. There is a very clear link between sex, love, and femininity here, and if the maids are compared to agents of these goddesses, it could be Homer's way of saying that their deaths were unjustified. The re-establishment of Odysseus' reign in Ithaca begins and ends with violence. Traitorous servants are tortured and killed, the sons of the most important families in Kephallonia are slaughtered, and now Odysseus can carry on with his three-step plan. He reveals himself to Penelope over a cunning discourse, which will be explored better in her own video. Then after finally sharing a night together after 20 years, he goes off to the countryside to find his father, Laertes. Following that, he starts a civil war, as if there wasn't enough violence already. But anyway, after the noble families of the kingdom attack in revenge for their dead sons, the suitors, Athena gets sick of all the war and tells them all to go home. You managed to make a war goddess tired of war. Is that technically possible? The remainder of Odysseus' reign and life is attested in the later text of the Telegony, which to my mind makes no sense at all. The entire thing is a huge mess. Odysseus goes away again, marries a queen in Thesproita or somewhere like that, and then returns before Telegonus, his hitherto unknown son by Circe, arrives and kills him with a stingray spear, contradicting the prophecy in Book 11 that he would die peacefully in old age by something coming from the sea. If Madeline Miller is to be believed, he becomes a despotic, paranoid tyrant in his later life, abusive to Penelope and Telemachus after having his entire world shaken up like an ant in a jam jar. His collapsed mental state makes sense. He seemed like he had given in to a dark madness during the battle, before the healing process with Penelope could begin. And the rest just doesn't sound right. After all this time, would a man who declined immortality and endless goddess sex go off again and sleep with more women? Well, it is Odysseus in fairness, we can never know anything for sure. But does this sound like a man who abuses his wife and servants and cheats on her again? The language in the original text says far too much about his emotional exhaustion after 20 years away from home. To me, that's a definite no. Odysseus the king, in theory, should have learned from his punishment and hubristic pride, been humbled by his reliance on so many people, and reign Ithaca peacefully with his queen. It's definitely possible that I'm blinded by my sheer love for this character. Flaws, stink, brine, and all. But I think that these three identities that define him make sense regardless of the ultimate outcome. Having said that, it's never wise to take Odysseus at face value, and there are plenty of flaws in this argument. Despite those, he is first and foremost Odysseus, the man of many twists and turns, which I think is answer enough in itself. Thank you very much for watching.